Hi, and welcome back to Among Therapists, Practical Tips, a podcast by Psychotherapy Academy. I'm your host, Dr. Jessica Diaz. Today, we're diving into the 13th episode of our series, The Middle Path for Trauma Work, a dialectical behavioral training. In our previous episode, we explored the foundational dialectical dilemma in DBT, the dilemma of acceptance versus change. In this episode, we'll be examining 5 more dialectical dilemmas that are particularly relevant to trauma survivors. These dilemmas manifest in the areas of awareness, thinking, emoting, reacting, and relating, where trauma survivors often experience responses that are either too much, too little, or both. Our faculty member today is Dr. Kirby Reuter. Dr. Reuter is a bilingual clinical psychologist who contracts with the United States Department of Homeland Security to provide treatment services for asylum seekers. He is a TED speaker and the author of the Dialectical Behavior Therapy Skills Workbook for PTSD, Practical Exercises for Overcoming Trauma and Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder. We're excited to announce that this extract is part of our new trauma training pathway, Proven ACT, DBT, and Prolonged Exposure Techniques. Embark on a journey to master trauma therapy through various evidence-based frameworks. This training program emphasizes practical knowledge, allowing you to transform these theories into actionable strategies for effective trauma treatment in complex scenarios. Enhance your trauma therapy skills now with our 3-dimensional e-learning program and earn up to 30.25 CE credits. Without further ado, here's Dr. Kirby Reuter.
Welcome to the 9th video in this module. In the previous video, we examined the most foundational of all dialectical dilemmas in DBT, the dilemma of acceptance versus change. In this video, we will explore 5 more dialectical dilemmas, which are especially relevant to trauma survivors. So let's get started. If you remember from a previous video, we talked about the polyvagal theory. Polyvagal theory explains why trauma survivors have extremes of too much or too little. So remember, the sympathetic nervous system is like that accelerator, and if we accelerate enough, we'll end up with fight or flight. Whereas the parasympathetic nervous system is like that brake, and if we brake enough, we'll end up with freeze. Which of those systems is overactivated and supercharged in trauma survivors? Remember, the answer is both. This phenomenon of both too much and too little leads to a variety of what DBT calls dialectical dilemmas. Dialectical dilemma is basically when a client is stuck at the extremes. So binary extremes leading to dysfunction. With trauma survivors, this occurs in 5 distinct areas. The areas of awareness, thinking, emoting, reacting, and relating. So in each of these domains, trauma survivors end up with responses that are either too much or too little or both. For example, with awareness, trauma survivors end up with both overawareness and underawareness. In clinical terminology, that would be hypervigilance versus dissociation. Trauma survivors also end up with both overthinking and underthinking. Or in more clinical terminology, obsessive rumination versus impulsive decision-making. Trauma survivors also end up with both over-emoting and under-emoting. In other words, emotional overwhelm versus emotional numbing. Trauma survivors also end up with both overreacting and underreacting. So in other words, maladaptive coping versus paralysis. And finally, trauma survivors also end up with both over-relating to other people versus under-relating. Or in other words, too much aggression versus too much passivity. Trauma-focused DBT provides a middle path for each of these dialectical dilemmas. The middle path between too much awareness or not enough awareness is mindfulness. The middle path between too much thinking or not enough thinking is dialectical thinking. The middle path between over-emoting or not emoting enough is emotion regulation. The middle path between overreacting versus underreacting is distress tolerance. And the middle path between aggression and passivity, or over-relating to others versus under-relating, is interpersonal effectiveness. That's why, in summary, TFDBT teaches the following skill sets: mindfulness, dialectical thinking, emotion regulation, distress tolerance, and interpersonal effectiveness. That's how we teach clients the middle path between the extremes that trauma causes them to experience. I actually like to think of DBT as simply developing balance therapy. That, in plain English, is precisely what we mean by dialectical behavioral therapy, just in terminology that are a real-world language that our clients actually use. So let's summarize with a few key points from this module. First of all, the polyvagal theory predicts the polarities we see in trauma survivors. Since both the sympathetic nervous system, the accelerator, and the parasympathetic nervous system, the brake, have been hijacked, trauma survivors display a variety of responses which are either too much or too little, or both. Second, for example, trauma survivors tend to demonstrate both overawareness and underawareness, hypervigilance versus dissociation, both overthinking and underthinking, or obsessive rumination versus impulsive decision-making, both over-emoting and under-emoting, or emotional overwhelm versus emotional numbness, both overreacting and underreacting, maladaptive coping versus paralysis. These tendencies even affect relationships which become either too aggressive or too passive. Third point, the 5 skill sets taught in DBT provide a practical middle path between each of these polarities. For example, mindfulness provides a middle path between hypervigilance versus dissociation. Distress tolerance provides a middle path between overreacting or maladaptive coping and underreacting or paralysis. Dialectical thinking provides a middle path between rumination versus impulsivity. Emotion regulation provides a middle path between emotional overwhelm versus emotional numbness. And interpersonal effectiveness provides a middle path between too much aggression versus too much passivity.
Okay, so in this episode, Dr. Reuter walked us through the 5 key dialectical dilemmas that trauma survivors often face due to the impact of trauma on their sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. We learned how these dilemmas manifest as polarities in awareness: hypervigilance versus dissociation, thinking, rumination versus impulsivity, emoting, overwhelm versus numbness, reacting, maladaptive coping versus paralysis, and relating, aggression versus passivity. Dr. Reuter highlighted how DBT provides a practical middle path for each of these dilemmas through the teaching of 5 core skills: mindfulness, dialectical thinking, emotion regulation, distress tolerance, and interpersonal effectiveness. By developing these skills, trauma survivors can find balance and navigate the extremes caused by their traumatic experiences. This episode underscores the value of DBT as a balance-developing therapy that equips clients with practical tools to regulate their emotions, tolerate distress, think dialectically, and relate effectively to others. As therapists, understanding these dialectical dilemmas and the corresponding DBT skills can help us better support our trauma survivor clients in their journey towards healing and balance. So, knowing the forefront trauma therapy skills isn't just about expanding your expertise. Imagine the feeling of confidence and fulfillment as you help one trauma patient after the other get back on their feet and finally feel like themselves again. Our new trauma training pathway, Proven ACT, DBT, and PE techniques will help you gain the confidence and skills to tackle even the most complex scenarios in the world of PTSD and trauma. With our three-dimensional approach, you will get a comprehensive training in acceptance and commitment therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, prolonged exposure, plus a bonus on trauma-informed stabilization treatment to enhance your therapeutic skills and upgrade your clinical practice. Enroll now and earn up to 30.25 CE credits on completion. If you're a psychologist, counselor, social worker, physician, or nursing professional, these credits are accepted by your professional board. You can click the link in the show notes to learn more about accreditation and the training. You can also access exclusive content which isn't covered in this podcast. This is an on-demand training, and all modules are available in multiple formats. You can watch videos, listen to audio, and download PDF transcripts. If you enjoyed this podcast, please help us spread the word by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts and sharing news of it on your social media. We are so grateful for your support. Thank you for listening. This was Dr. Jessica Diaz. See you soon for the next episode. Bye-bye.